I found out that my parents had signed over the family metal shop to my sister's husband, so I stopped pulling 80-hour weeks for nothing. A week later, my dad called in a panic, saying, "Our biggest client is about to walk away." I answered calmly, "Let the new owner handle it." 10 years. 80-hour weeks. No pay, just a promise. Then, one cold Friday night, I found a sealed envelope that proved my entire life was a lie. My family had signed away everything I'd built, not to me, but to a man who couldn't tell a drill bit from a reamer. It started, as most things do, with a dream. Not entirely my own at first, but one I adopted with every fiber of my being. I'm Olivia, and for the better part of a decade, I poured my soul into my family's metal shop in Green Bay, Wisconsin. 80 hours a week, sometimes more. No paycheck, no benefits, just the unspoken understanding that one day, all of it, would be mine. The legacy my grandfather built with his bare hands, the hum of the machines, the smell of cutting oil that clung to my clothes even after a hot shower, every burn, every scar, every sleepless night spent coaxing precision out of stubborn metal felt worth it. Because I believed I was earning a future. My future. I grew up in that world, the industrial zone near the bay, a maze of concrete and sparks. The only woman who worked there full-time. The only one who could swap a carbide insert faster than most of the guys could finish their morning coffee. They used to stare when I first arrived, a mix of curiosity and doubt, waiting for me to quit and find a more suitable job. But I didn't. I stayed. I learned every sound those machines made, every tremor through the concrete floor, every subtle smell that screamed something was off. This shop, Hart Metal Works, was in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather started it in 1970 with one battered CNC mill and a dream. He even slept on a cot in the corner during those first freezing winters because he couldn't afford to heat the place. When I was little, he'd let me sit on his knee and press the green cycle start button. I still remember the thrill when the spindle roared to life, the soft, raw scream of metal cutting metal, like the heartbeat of something alive. When he passed, my father took over. He wasn't a dreamer like Grandpa, he was practical, cautious. But he loved the business, and I desperately wanted to make him proud. While my older sister, Claire, chased marketing internships in Chicago, I enrolled at a technical institute. I wanted to program machines, design custom jigs, make metal bend to my will. And when I graduated, I came straight back to the shop, believing I'd earned my place the old-fashioned way, by showing up earlier and staying later than everyone else. And I did. When I joined, we had 6 mills and 3 lathes. Within a decade, we grew to 10 mills and 5 lathes, taking on contracts with medical device manufacturers, even aerospace suppliers. I ran the machines, designed fixtures, handled quality control, and negotiated directly with clients when a drawing came in with impossible tolerances. If a part needed to be within 3 microns, it was my responsibility. If a customer sent an emergency job on a Friday night, I was the one who stayed until dawn to finish it. The work was brutal. The machines ran hot and loud. My hands were permanently rough from deburring sharp edges, my nails kept short because long nails just didn't survive in this trade. I learned to read the machines by ear. A faint chatter meant a dull tool. A deeper hum meant the spindle load was too high. When others couldn't figure out why a part was off, I'd stand beside the mill, listen for 10 seconds, and know exactly which offset to tweak. They called it intuition. I called it obsession. There were nights I'd look at the clock and realize it was 2 a.m., the whole industrial park dark except for the glow of our shop's sodium lights. Sometimes I'd take a break, sit on the loading dock, watching fog rise from the bay. My reflection stared back from the oily puddles on the concrete, and I'd think, this is my life. This is the price of building something that lasts. Clients started asking for me by name. Engineers from huge firms sent their blueprints directly to Olivia at Hart Metal Works. One even joked, if she's on the job, we can stop worrying about the specs. Every compliment made the long hours feel lighter. Every time my father said, "You're the future of this place, kiddo," I believed him. He said it so often it became a promise carved into my chest. I never asked for a paycheck. My parents said the money was being reinvested, that I was building equity. They provided a room upstairs, dinner at the family house, telling me it was enough for now. One day, this will all be yours, Olivia, my mother would whisper, touching my shoulder as I came home covered in grime. I smiled because I believed her. I didn't need contracts or titles or paperwork. I had trust. I had family. And I had my hands, the same hands that once fit inside my grandfather's gloves, now calloused and steady, shaping metal just the way he taught me. For 10 years, I gave that shop everything, every hour, every ounce of energy, every part of me that could still move after the sun went down. The machines didn't stop, and neither did I. My alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., and the first thing I did was stretch my back, which had started aching before I turned 30. By 5 a.m., I was at the shop, the lights flickering on one by one, the cold air thick with the smell of metal dust. I'd prep the CNC mills, load programs, calibrate offsets, and by the time anyone else showed up, the first run was already complete. No one ever asked why I worked so hard, because everyone already knew the answer or thought they did. "You're doing it for yourself," my father would say, with that tone of patient authority, like he was handing me wisdom. "You're building your own future. This is all for you." My mother would nod beside him, a soft smile on her face. "One day, sweetheart, when it's yours, you'll be grateful you stuck it out." So, I believed them. I truly believed that the long nights, the skipped dinners, the birthdays spent at the shop were all part of some greater plan that would one day make sense. The truth is, I didn't have a life outside those walls. My friends stopped inviting me out years ago. I missed weddings, holidays, even my sister's baby shower. When I wasn't at the shop, I was asleep. And when I wasn't asleep, I was thinking about the shop. My hands were cracked from coolant and metal dust. My hair, once long and shiny, was singed from welding sparks. I had scars on my forearms from hot shavings and tiny burns that never healed quite right. My nails were split and gray from the oil, but I wore them like medals. There were days my body begged for rest, my lower back throbbing like a warning light I never turned off. I'd tell myself pain was proof I was earning something. When exhaustion blurred my vision, I'd remind myself, "You're the future of this place." That phrase was my father's most frequent mantra, and every time he said it, it felt like a promise I couldn't afford to break. Vacations? Not in my vocabulary. When the crew took time off, I covered their shifts. "The business can't run without you," Dad said once, half joking. I smiled, not realizing it was truer than he meant. Once I took a single weekend to visit an old college friend. I came back to find 2 jobs behind schedule and a mess of broken tool paths. My father shook his head. "See what happens when you're gone." From then on, I never left again. I told myself it was loyalty. Deep down, it was fear. Fear that if I wasn't there, they'd find a way to prove I wasn't needed. Love was another casualty. I tried dating once, a civil engineer named Mark. He was kind, patient, fascinated by what I did. But after a few months of canceled dinners and rescheduled weekends, he stopped calling. I couldn't even promise him a Friday night without my phone buzzing with an urgent call from the shop. "You always say you're almost done," he said quietly. "But you never are." He was right. I never was. The shop became both my cage and my cathedral. Every time I heard the steady hum of the machines, it felt like purpose. Every time I wiped sweat from my forehead and looked at the finished parts gleaming under the lights, it felt like pride. And when my parents walked through the door, smiling at the efficiency reports, it felt like approval, the kind of approval I had spent my entire life chasing. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I became indispensable, they would see me not just as a daughter, but as an equal. There were small moments, though, when doubt crept in. Like when my father handed my sister a check for helping with marketing, even though she hadn't stepped foot in the shop for years. Or when my mother casually said, "You know, Chad might take the business to another level once he gets more involved," and my stomach tightened, though I didn't yet understand why. I pushed the feelings down. Family was family. I told myself not to compare. I believed that merit, like gravity, would eventually pull things into balance, but it never did. Looking back now, my biggest mistake wasn't working too hard. It was believing that fairness would just happen on its own. That love and loyalty would naturally lead to justice. I thought if I became the best, if I carried every burden, if I proved myself beyond question, they would have no choice but to give me what I'd earned. I was wrong. In a family business, merit doesn't always win. Sometimes it's silenced. Sometimes it's quietly replaced. And sometimes you don't realize you've been erased until it's already too late. Around 2020, Chad Walker entered my life, or rather, invaded it. He came in wearing pressed shirts, polished shoes, and that practiced confidence of someone who's read more business books than they've lived real days in a factory. My sister Claire brought him home for dinner one evening, her voice practically glowing. "Chad just finished his MBA at Northwestern," she gushed. "He's brilliant, Olivia. You'll love how his mind works." Brilliant. That word lingered in the air like a bad perfume. It was the same word people used when they didn't have evidence of actual skill. I shook his hand across the dinner table that night. His grip was too firm, his smile too white. "So, you're the engineer," he said, like I was some novelty item he'd just discovered. "That's impressive. Women in manufacturing, that's rare." I forced a smile. I'd heard that line before, just not in such a patronizing tone. A few months later, my parents announced that Chad would be joining the family business to help modernize operations. Supposedly, he was there to digitize processes, build the brand, develop new partnerships. The truth? He spent his first week walking around with his phone, taking photos of machines he didn't understand, posting them on the company Instagram with captions like, "Innovation never sleeps," or "Another successful day at Heart Metal Works." The comments were mostly bots, but my parents were ecstatic. "Look at the engagement," my mom said, eyes shining. "He's bringing us into the modern age." Meanwhile, I was crawling under a CNC lathe that had just jammed, covered in oil and metal dust. I remember looking across the shop at him, me in heavy gloves, sweat pouring down my neck, him, sipping a $10 latte, scrolling on his tablet and realizing how differently the same word, work, could look. Chad's schedule was generous. He'd show up around 10:30, sometimes 11 a.m., with a Starbucks cup in one hand and his Bluetooth headset in the other. "Just had a call with a potential partner," he'd say, even though his screen showed nothing but ESPN scores. He'd stay for a few hours, disappear for a lunch meeting, and return around 3 p.m., usually in time to make one more post or chat with suppliers I'd already handled. By 4:30, he was gone. And yet, unlike me, Chad got paid. $60,000 a year, my mother proudly told me, as if announcing a promotion. "He's bringing real business expertise," she said. "We can't expect him to volunteer like you do." I stared at her, stunned. I'd worked 10 years without a single paycheck. 10 years of grinding, bleeding, missing holidays, and now they were cutting checks for a man who didn't even know what G-code was. When Chad got his company truck, a brand new Ford F-150 with custom detailing, I didn't even pretend to smile. "He needs reliable transportation for client visits," Dad said, handing him the keys. "You still have your old pickup, right?" I looked out the window at my rusted, 20-year-old Chevy with its cracked windshield and oil stains. I didn't answer. I told myself it didn't matter. I was the engineer. He was just the figurehead. Let him play dress up. Let him stand in front of the machines for photos and pretend he knew what torque limits were. The clients knew who actually got the job done. I convinced myself the work would speak for itself. But slowly, I started to see something shift. During meetings, my parents began turning to him first. "Chad, what do you think of this? Chad, maybe you could handle the client presentation?" I'd sit across the table, covered in small cuts and bruises from the shop, watching as he talked in circles, using words like scalability, efficiency matrix, digital footprint. And they'd nod like he was speaking gospel. Sometimes he'd glance at me mid-sentence, just long enough to flash that polite, empty smile that said, "You stay in your lane." One evening, we were closing up. I'd just finished a 14-hour day fine-tuning a titanium mold. Chad was near the front office, talking to Claire. I overheard her laugh, a condescending sound. "Olivia's the technical one," she said, "but Chad's the strategist. That's what keeps the business alive." That line cut deeper than any metal shard ever had. You're the technician. He's the strategist. As if execution was meaningless. As if years of sweat and scars were somehow less valuable than PowerPoint slides and buzzwords. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was rewriting history in real time, turning my labor into his legacy. I'd see posts online. Under Chad's leadership, Hart Metal Works enters a new era of innovation. My designs, my builds, my clients, all stamped with his name. My father would beam with pride every time someone mentioned Chad at a networking event. He's got vision, he'd say. Finally, someone who understands both sides of the business. Meanwhile, I was still sleeping in the same childhood room above the garage, still driving a pickup that rattled every time I shifted gears, still waiting for the acknowledgement that never came. I told myself to ignore it, to keep working, to let the numbers, the output, the quality speak for me. But deep down, a quiet fear had started to grow. Because I'd seen this pattern before, just not in my family. I'd seen it in trade school, in every factory, in every meeting where I was the only woman at the table. The talkers rise while the workers fade into the background. For months, I bit my tongue, smiled through the injustice, and told myself I was being paranoid. But every day Chad stayed longer in the office, every meeting he led, every decision my parents deferred to him made one truth sink deeper into my bones. I was being replaced. Not by someone better, but by someone who looked the part. I realized my biggest threat wasn't incompetence. It was charm. Chad didn't need to outwork me. He just needed to outtalk me. And in a family where words carried more weight than sweat, I was already losing. Transition to a shot of a dim workshop, with a single light source highlighting a dusty filing cabinet. Olivia's voice becomes more intense. It happened on one of those nights that blended into all the others, past midnight. The rest of the city asleep, the shop humming softly like a living thing. I was alone as usual, reviewing quality control files for a titanium order due in the morning. The parts gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, perfect to the last micron, their surfaces cold and sharp. My hands were blackened with grease and ink from the paperwork, my brain on autopilot after 14 straight hours. All I wanted was to finish and go home. I pulled open the filing cabinet to double-check purchase orders, but one folder slipped free and hit the floor. When I bent down, I noticed a red envelope, half hidden behind a stack of old binders. The bold, stamped letters across it read "Confidential." It wasn't mine, and I'd never seen it before. Something about the way it was tucked away made my stomach tighten. I wiped my hands on a rag, sat down at the desk, and hesitated for just a second before sliding my finger under the seal. Inside were legal documents, pages of formal text, and signatures that didn't make sense at first. The words "transfer of ownership" were printed at the top, clean and final. I kept reading, my eyes moving faster as understanding began to dawn. The new owner of Hart Metal Works was Chad Walker. Not my father, not my mother, not me. My name didn't appear anywhere except once, buried in an appendix labeled Employee List. The transfer had been signed, notarized, and dated 4 months earlier. My father's signature. My mother's. The ink looked fresh enough to still smell faintly of toner. My throat went dry. My chest tightened as if the air had thickened around me. I flipped through the pages again and again, hoping I'd missed something, a clause, an addendum, a single line that included me. There was nothing. The hum of the machines in the background seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. For years, I had believed I was working towards something bigger than myself, that all the hours and sacrifices were bricks in a foundation I'd one day inherit. And now, on cheap white paper, I was being erased from that story entirely. I stared down at my hands, oil-stained, scarred, fingertips rough from a decade of metal and heat. These were the hands that had built this place. Every machine, every fixture, every custom jig had passed through them. And yet, somehow, they didn't count. My parents had chosen a man who couldn't tell a drill bit from a reamer over their own daughter. They had traded experience for image, sweat for charm, substance for show. The anger came fast, raw, and hot. I slammed the folder shut, the echo sharp against the metal walls. But beneath the anger was something worse, a deep, aching grief. Not for the loss of the business, but for the devastating realization that the people I trusted most had never really seen me. I had spent a decade proving myself, and it still wasn't enough. I sat there for a long time, staring at the flickering light above the desk, replaying every conversation, every year, every future of this place that suddenly felt like a lie. When the clock on the wall hit 3 a.m., I made my decision. I was done. I pulled out a piece of company letterhead and began to write, the pen shaking in my hand, to the management of Heart Metal Works, effective immediately. I resign from my position. Good luck running this place without me. I signed it simply, Olivia Hart. When I set the pen down, a strange calm settled over me. The kind that comes right after a wound stops bleeding, when the pain is still there, but quieter. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on my father's desk, right beside the brass nameplate that still read Owner. Then I walked through the shop one last time, tracing my fingers along the machines I'd maintained like old friends. The air smelled of steel and betrayal. I gathered a few things that truly mattered: my notebook of tool settings, a photo of Grandpa and me from my first day at the shop, and his welding gloves, stiff with age, but still fitting perfectly. He'd given them to me when I turned 18, saying, "These gloves build things that last. Don't ever hand them to someone who doesn't know how to use them." I slipped them into my bag. When I stepped outside, dawn was just beginning to break over the bay. The air was sharp, the sky streaked with gray and pale orange. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't have anywhere I needed to be. The parking lot was empty except for my old pickup, its hood dusted with frost. I climbed in, turned the key, and sat for a moment as the engine sputtered to life. My reflection in the windshield looked older than 32, eyes tired, face lined. A decade of exhaustion and disappointment carved into every feature. As I pulled out of the lot, I didn't look back. The shop lights glowed behind me, a distant hum fading into silence. My grandfather's gloves rested on the passenger seat, the leather worn smooth where his hands used to be. I placed mine over them, whispering under my breath, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." I tried. Then I drove away, leaving behind the building that had once felt like home, but now felt like a grave. For the first time, the road stretched open in front of me, cold, uncertain, but mine. 8 days passed. 8 long, quiet, disorienting days. The first few felt like I was detoxing from a life I didn't know had poisoned me. My body didn't understand what to do without the constant vibration of machines or the sharp tang of cutting fluid in the air. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, sit up in bed, and feel that fleeting panic of being late. Then remember there was nowhere to be. I was crashing at my friend Melissa's small apartment above her bakery. She didn't ask questions, just left coffee on the counter and gave me space to breathe. For the first time in a decade, I could smell something other than metal. By the 8th day, I had almost stopped checking my phone. The silence from my parents was louder than any argument could have been. I told myself they wouldn't reach out, that they'd double down on their decision and prove me right. I was wrong. That afternoon, while I was helping Melissa carry flour bags in from the delivery truck, my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but my chest tightened anyway. I wiped my hands and answered, "Olivia." My father's voice cracked through the line before I could even respond. It wasn't the steady, commanding tone I grew up with, it was strained, uneven. "Thank God you picked up." I froze. "Dad, it's Steel Core Dynamics," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "They're threatening to pull their contract. Chad's been handling their last order, and apparently the specs are off. They said the parts don't match the tolerances you used to run. They won't sign off until someone fixes it." His breath hitched. "We can't afford to lose them. That's 40% of our revenue. You have to come back." For a second, my old instincts kicked in. I could almost see the machine in my head, hear the spindle whirring wrong, feel the fix waiting in my fingertips. Every part of me wanted to grab my keys, drive straight to the shop, and set things right. That's what I'd always done. Clean up their messes, make things work. But then I remembered that red envelope. I remembered the signatures. I remembered the look of my name on that employee list, buried beneath the man who took everything I'd built. I took a deep breath and said quietly, I don't work there anymore. Olivia. Dad snapped, his voice rising with panic. This isn't about that right now. We need you. Chad needs you. He's trying, but he doesn't understand the technical side. Then maybe he shouldn't be the owner of a machine shop, I cut in. My voice didn't shake this time. It came out calm, flat, final. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear him inhale, like he was about to argue, then stop himself. For once, he had no quick fix, no authority to lean on. Please, he said after a long silence. We're drowning here. I stared out the window at the soft gray of late winter, the smell of yeast and cinnamon drifting from below. It struck me how different this air was, how clean it felt to breathe without oil and betrayal in it. You made your choice, I said softly. Let the air handle it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost picture him standing in the office, surrounded by paperwork he didn't understand, Chad pacing beside him, trying to bluff his way through another disaster. When he didn't answer, I added, "Good luck, Dad." Then I hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, the phone still in my hand, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Not from fear this time, but from something sharper, something that felt like power. I turned the phone face down on the counter and exhaled, realizing my hands were shaking. Not because I was angry, but because for the first time in my life, I hadn't rushed back to fix things. I hadn't sacrificed myself for someone else's comfort. For 10 years, every boundary I'd had was blurred by obligation and guilt. But that one phone call, the plea in my father's voice, the quiet click of ending it, became the line I'd never cross again. I wasn't their safety net anymore. I wasn't their unpaid labor or invisible heir. I was just Olivia. And for the first time in a decade, that felt like enough. By the way, if you're still with me on this wild ride, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are so many more unbelievable stories coming your way. It was a gray Sunday morning, the kind where the sky looks like brushed metal and the air smells faintly of rain. I had stopped at Miller's Diner, a small place on the corner of Jefferson Avenue, the kind of spot that still served coffee in chipped mugs and played soft country music through an old radio. I sat in my usual booth by the window, eating scrambled eggs and toast, trying to convince myself that this was what peace looked like, quiet, unremarkable, ordinary. Then I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when the door swung open and the bell above it chimed, I froze mid-bite. My parents walked in, followed closely by Claire and Chad. My father's face was red, his jaw tight. My mother looked nervous, her hands clutched around her purse strap. Claire had that look she always wore when she wanted to appear composed, but was barely holding it together. And Chad, of course, stood behind them, perfectly pressed shirt, smug little half-smile, like he was walking into a board meeting. He thought he'd already won. They spotted me immediately. My mother hesitated, whispering something to my father, but he ignored her and marched straight toward my table. The diner went quiet. Forks paused midair, conversations fading into the low hum of the fluorescent lights. "Olivia," my father said, standing over me, his voice heavy with authority. "We need to talk." I didn't look up right away. I finished chewing, swallowed, and calmly set my fork down. "About what?" His voice rose. "About this childish behavior. About what you've done. The family needs you." I looked at him, genuinely confused. The family? Or the business? He blinked, not expecting the question. "They're the same thing," he said firmly. "Are they?" I asked, leaning back in the booth. "Because it didn't feel that way when you signed everything over to your son-in-law. Don't make this bigger than it is. You're blowing things out of proportion. Chad just wanted to help." I laughed. A short, humorless sound. "Help? He owns it, Claire. You call that helping?" Chad finally spoke, sliding his hands into his pockets like he'd been waiting for his cue. "No one's saying you didn't contribute, Olivia, but no one is irreplaceable." The air in the diner seemed to thicken. I looked up at him slowly, meeting his eyes. "Is that right?" I said softly. "Then maybe you can tell me what a tolerance stack-up is." His confident expression flickered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, my voice steady now. "Or maybe you can tell me the difference between a G2 and a G3 command." Or what coolant ratio you use for titanium versus 6061 aluminum. I paused, letting it hang. No, didn't think so. A few people in nearby booths had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the waitress paused by the coffee pot. I leaned forward slightly. Let me remind you of something, Chad. 93% of the CNC drawings in that shop were written by me. 40% of your current revenue came from Steel Core Dynamics, a contract I negotiated. Every custom jig, every precision part your team still uses was built by my hands. So tell me again, who's replaceable? For a moment, no one spoke. Chad's face flushed, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. My father slammed his hand down on the table, making the plates rattle. That's enough. We didn't come here to argue technicalities. We came here to bring you home. I stared at the hand on the table, at the veins pulsing beneath his skin. Then I looked up at him with a calm I didn't entirely feel. Home, I repeated. That stopped being home the moment you handed my life's work to someone who doesn't even know how to start a spindle. My mother's voice came next, soft and trembling. Olivia, please. Your father's right. You've always been strong. You can build something anywhere. But Chad, he needs this opportunity. He needs the stability. Her words landed like a punch to the chest. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. He needs stability? I said quietly. Mom, I've spent 10 years holding that place together while everyone else took vacations and bonuses. I worked myself into the ground, and you're telling me he needs it more than I do. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Claire reached out, her tone falsely gentle. Olivia, you can't be angry about this forever. It's business. You're brilliant at what you do. You'll land on your feet. I stood up slowly, the leather of the booth creaking beneath me. You're right, I said. I will. For a moment, the four of them stood there watching me, maybe waiting for me to apologize, to cave, to become the dependable daughter again. But I was done. I picked up my bag, set a few bills on the table for the uneaten half of my breakfast, and turned to leave. As I walked past them, I stopped for just a second beside my mother. You said he needs a chance, I said quietly. Well, I gave you all 10 years of mine. Now it's my turn to walk away. I pushed open the diner door, the bell ringing sharply behind me. The air outside was cold and clean, and for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, muffled through the glass, calling my name. I didn't turn around. The diner windows reflected the four of them, standing together, confused, angry, and small. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need their permission to leave. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine. By the next morning, I knew what I had to do. The leather notebook was more than nostalgia, it was a key. But if I wanted justice, sentiment wouldn't be enough. I needed proof, structure, and someone who could turn my grandfather's words into a weapon sharp enough to cut through legal paper. That's when I called Lena Mendoza. Lena and I had gone to the same technical college years ago. While I'd gone into mechanical engineering, she'd pivoted, finishing law school and opening her own small firm in Milwaukee, specializing in business disputes. We hadn't spoken in years, but when she picked up the phone, her voice was the same, brisk, confident, a hint of warmth hiding under professional steel. Olivia Hart, she said. It's been a decade. What's going on? Family business, I said dryly. Literally. I told her everything, the unpaid years, the betrayal, the red envelope, the transfer papers, and finally, my grandfather's journal. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a pause. Send me everything, she said. And Olivia, don't talk to them again without me. 2 days later, I drove to her office. The place was modest. No marble floors or receptionist with perfect hair, just shelves stacked with binders and a framed degree on the wall. Lena was at her desk, hair tied up, glasses perched low on her nose, as she flipped through the documents I'd sent. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright. Okay, she said, tapping the folder with her pen. We can do this, but we need to be smart. There are 3 things we have to prove. 1, that you are the technical backbone of the business. 2, that your parents' transfer to Chad violates your grandfather's founder intent. And 3, she paused, a small grin forming. That your dear brother-in-law is not only unqualified, but possibly committing financial misconduct. I exhaled. That last one shouldn't be too hard. The next few weeks blurred into focus. I became a detective in my own life, piecing together the trail of proof buried under years of loyalty. Every night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents, coffee-stained notebooks, and a flash drive full of company data I'd saved before quitting. The first evidence was my track record. I went through hundreds of client emails, each one a time-stamped footprint of my contribution. There was one from a steel core engineer. Olivia's precision saved our project. If she hadn't caught the misalignment, we'd have lost the entire prototype batch. Another from Aerodynamics Corp. Olivia, your tolerance corrections are the reason we renewed this contract. Then came the numbers. Using spreadsheets I'd built years ago, I charted the company's growth during my tenure. In 10 years, under my technical leadership, revenue had climbed 180%. Before that, barely 30%. The data spoke louder than any defense my parents could fabricate. But what sealed the pattern wasn't my success. It was Chad's failure. One night, Lena called me after reviewing some of the financial statements I'd found on an old company drive. Olivia, she said, her tone almost amused. Your brother-in-law might just hand us this case himself. The company credit card history read like a parody, thousands of dollars in client entertainment that coincidentally matched dates of Packers games. A $3,000 charge for networking dinners in Miami during a week when no trade conferences existed. And my personal favorite, a $5,000 home theater system labeled as office equipment, shipped directly to Chad's address. When Lena saw the list, she shook her head. You can't make this up. He's a walking audit violation. Still, she wanted more. We'll need internal witness statements. Something from people who've worked under both of you. Bonus points if they've seen him screw up firsthand. That's when I called David Clean, one of the oldest machinists still working at the shop. He'd started under my grandfather in the late 80s and stayed long enough to see every era of the business, the expansion, the modernization, and now the decay. When I met him at a small coffee shop downtown, he looked older, but just as solid, calloused hands, gray beard, and the kind of quiet honesty that never aged. I heard what happened, he said, shaking his head. Your grandfather would be sick over it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old file folder. I've been cleaning my garage. Found these contracts your granddad wrote himself. Look at the language. See how over the years he starts adding words like team share, collaborative ownership, collective equity. He was moving toward fairness, Olivia, not hierarchy. I flipped through the documents, feeling my throat tighten. He really meant it, I whispered. David nodded. He used to say it all the time. Olivia's got my hands and my heart. She'll carry the shop forward one day. I never forgot that. When I brought the folder back to Lena, she smiled for the first time since we started. This, she said, holding up the page with Grandpa's evolving contract clauses, is gold. Founder intent, documented progression, direct testimony from someone who worked beside him. Combined with your grandfather's journal, it's airtight. I stared at her, disbelief and relief fighting for space in my chest. So, we have enough? Lena closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her expression firm. We have more than enough. The technical evidence proves your contribution. The financial records bury Chad. And your grandfather's words? They give us moral gravity the court will respect. She paused, then smiled faintly. Get some rest, Olivia, because the next time you walk into that building, it won't be as an employee. It'll be as the rightful heir of its soul. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. And when I woke up, I didn't feel small or erased anymore. I felt ready. The courthouse in Green Bay was a tall, gray building that looked like it had never known warmth. The steps echoed under my boots as I climbed them, my stride steady, but my stomach tight. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and paper, sterile, formal, unbending. I spotted Lena near the end of the corridor, sleek in a navy suit, flipping through our files with calm precision. She looked up, saw me, and gave a short nod. You ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. She smiled slightly. Good, because today you stop being the invisible worker. Today, they finally have to look at you. The courtroom was packed, local press, a few old clients, even some former employees who'd heard about the case. My parents sat at the defendant's table beside Chad, who wore an expensive gray suit and the smug expression of a man convinced he could talk his way out of anything. My mother refused to meet my eyes. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Judge Harris entered, a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who'd seen every kind of human foolishness. When he spoke, his voice carried like iron. Case number 24-315, Hart versus Walker. Let's begin. Lena rose first. Her voice was steady, crisp, and deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about inheritance. It's about integrity. It's about a woman who gave 10 years of her life to a business built by her grandfather, only to be erased from its future. We will show that Olivia Hart was the technical and operational core of Hart Metal Works, that the transfer of ownership to Chad Walker violated documented founder intent, and that Mr. Walker is unfit to run the business due to both incompetence and financial misconduct. Then she began the presentation. She projected the first exhibit onto the screen, a page from my grandfather's leather notebook, the handwriting elegant and firm. Whoever builds with their hands and mind owns a piece of the workshop's soul. The courtroom was silent as the words hung in the air. Next came the photographs, my 12-year-old self welding under my grandfather's supervision. Rows of machines I had calibrated. Client thank you emails praising my precision. Then spreadsheets, 10 years of data showing the company's 180% growth during my leadership of technical operations. Finally, the financial statements, each one with highlighted charges, Packers tickets, a business retreat in Miami, a $5,000 home theater system labeled as office equipment. The audience murmured when Lena said softly, all charged to company funds. When it was my turn, she called me to the stand. My palms were cold, but my voice was steady. I described what the last decade had looked like: 80-hour weeks, oil burns, sleepless nights fixing machines that others couldn't. I thought I was investing in my future, I said quietly. My parents told me I was working for something that would one day be mine. I didn't realize I was building a throne for someone else. Then came Chad's turn. He strutted to the witness stand, flashing his practiced smile to the room. His lawyer, a man from Milwaukee with a slick tie and a smooth voice, began gently. Mr. Walker, could you explain your role at Hart Metal Works? Chad straightened his shoulders. I modernized the company's marketing, introduced digital strategy, and brought us into the 21st century. Before me, there was no online presence, no outreach. Lena stood up. Cross-examination, Your Honor. Judge Harris nodded. Proceed. She approached slowly, like a surgeon preparing an incision. Mr. Walker, she said, you claim to have modernized operations. Could you please name 3 clients you personally brought into the company during your tenure? Chad blinked. Well, I was building relationships. These things take time. Names, Lena pressed. He hesitated. I'd have to check the records. Lena tilted her head. Very well. Then, for the record, can you describe the process of setting up a CNC mill for a precision titanium order? A pause. That's not really my area of focus. I delegate that to the operators. Lena's tone didn't change. And yet you are the sole owner of a machining business, correct? He shifted in his seat. Yes, but I handle the big picture. Leadership isn't about. She cut him off. What was the company's quarterly revenue as of last quarter? He frowned. Well, again, I'd need to confirm. So, you don't know the answer? Not off the top of my head. Lena turned to the judge. Your Honor, this man cannot name a single client, cannot describe the process that produces his company's product, and cannot identify basic financial metrics. Yet, he claims to lead this business. She faced Chad again, voice like ice. Mr. Walker, a company cannot be led by someone who doesn't understand how it runs. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint squeak of the judge's pen as he took notes. When Lena sat down, I caught the faintest flicker of panic cross my father's face. My mother reached for his hand, but he pulled away. For the first time, they looked unsure. Not angry, not defensive, just small. After a brief recess, Judge Harris turned to me. "Miss Hart, before I render my decision, would you like to make a final statement?" I stood. My legs trembled, but my voice didn't. "Your Honor, I'm not here to reclaim property. I'm here to reclaim truth. My grandfather believed that work gives people dignity. That what you build with your hands and your heart belongs to you, at least in spirit. I don't need the company. I don't need the name. I just want his intent honored, and I want to stop men like Chad from turning honest labor into someone else's profit." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. He looked down at the notebook in front of him, then at me. "Thank you, Miss Hart." When I sat back down, Lena whispered, "That was perfect." As the gavel struck, signaling that judgment would be delivered in 3 days, I realized something profound. Win or lose, I had already done what my grandfather had wanted me to do. I had stood my ground with both hands steady and my heart unshakably my own. 3 days later, I stood once again in that cold, echoing courtroom, my palms damp, but my heart steady. The air felt heavier than before, that quiet, suspended kind of stillness that comes right before something irreversible. My parents sat a few rows ahead, Claire beside them, her arms folded tightly, eyes red as if she hadn't slept. Chad stared straight ahead, jaw tense, his arrogance finally cracked. When Judge Harris entered, everyone rose. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and glanced over the thick stack of files in front of him, my grandfather's notebook, Lena's evidence binders, the company ledgers, the photographs. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried through the room like a verdict written in stone. "I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this case." He began, "This matter concerns not merely a business transaction, but the question of legacy and the responsibilities that come with it." He paused, scanning the courtroom before continuing. "The late founder of Hart Metal Works, Mr. Robert Hart, left behind clear written philosophies reflecting his belief that ownership should align with labor and contribution. While not a formal legal will, his journals and corroborating testimony from long-term employees established clear founder intent." I held my breath. "Furthermore," he said, "the plaintiff, Olivia Hart, has provided compelling evidence demonstrating her role as the primary technical and operational driver of the business over the past decade. Testimonial statements and client correspondence confirm that approximately 93% of products and operations were directly under her supervision or design. Statistical data shows significant growth during her tenure." He shifted his gaze toward Chad. "Conversely, evidence indicates that the defendant, Mr. Chad Walker, engaged in financial misconduct and lacked both the qualifications and technical understanding required to manage this company. His use of company funds for personal expenses further undermines his fitness as an owner." My stomach tightened as I watched Chad's confident posture crumble. "Therefore," the judge said, each word deliberate, "the court finds the transfer of ownership to Mr. Walker invalid. The succession plan is hereby nullified as inconsistent with founder intent and inequitable to the primary contributor." A ripple moved through the courtroom. A soft gasp from someone behind me, the sound of a pen dropping. But the judge wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "given the current state of Hart Metal Works, including operational collapse, loss of major clients, and outstanding debts, the court orders that the business be appraised, liquidated, and sold. After debts are paid, and any misused company funds are reimbursed by Mr. Walker, the remaining proceeds shall be divided equally between the founder's 2 biological children, Miss Olivia Hart and Miss Claire Hart." He looked directly at me. "Miss Hart, this court recognizes your immeasurable contribution and your grandfather's intent that your work be honored, but it also recognizes the reality that the business as it stands cannot recover. What remains will allow you to start anew." He struck the gavel once, firm, final, echoing. "Court is adjourned." The sound felt like both an ending and a clean break. For a long moment, no one moved. My father stared down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. My mother's face was pale, blank, not angry anymore, just hollow. Claire leaned toward her husband, whispering something sharp that made him flinch. Lena exhaled beside me, gathering her papers, but her eyes softened when she turned toward me. "You won," she said quietly. I nodded, but the words didn't feel like victory. "I know." Outside, the afternoon light was cold and bright against the courthouse steps. I stood there for a while, letting it hit my face, letting the noise of the world replace the silence of judgment. Reporters lingered near the curb, murmuring, but no one approached. I think they could tell this wasn't the kind of story that ended with celebration. 2 months later, after the sale of the company and the deductions for debt and restitution, I received the final number, $63,000. It arrived by direct deposit with a one-line email from Lena, "Settlement complete." "Congratulations, Olivia." I stared at the number for a long time. It wasn't a fortune, but it was freedom. Enough to breathe, to start over, enough to build something small, and this time, mine alone. But there was no joy. Not really. Just a long, quiet exhale. That night, I sat in my apartment with a single lamp on and opened my grandfather's notebook again. The pages were smudged from my fingers, soft at the edges. I ran my hand over his handwriting, his words still echoing in my mind. "Whoever builds with their hands and mind owns a piece of the workshop's soul," I whispered into the stillness. "I did build it, Grandpa. I just didn't get to keep it." The next morning, Lena called. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," I said after a pause. "I won the case. But it feels like I lost something bigger." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't lose it," she said finally. "You outgrew it." After we hung up, I drove past the old factory one last time. The sign had already been taken down, the windows empty, the loading bay locked. It looked smaller than I remembered, not the kingdom I'd once thought it was, but just a building of steel and concrete. The ghosts were gone, and so was I. As I drove away, the horizon opened up ahead, wide and clean. And though the ache was still there, that hollow space where my family used to be, I felt something else rising in its place. Not revenge, not triumph, just clarity. I hadn't fought for ownership. I had fought for truth, for the right to stand beside my grandfather's memory and say, I kept my part of the promise. And maybe that was enough. 6 months after the verdict, the dust of everything I'd lost had finally started to settle. And from it, something new began to take shape. I signed a short-term lease on a small industrial space in Ashwaubenon, just outside Green Bay. It wasn't much to look at, bare concrete floors, a cracked roll-up door, and walls that still smelled faintly of motor oil. But when I stood in the middle of it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. With part of the settlement money, I bought 2 used CNC mills, 1 lathe, and a small TG welder, machines that others called outdated. But to me, they were familiar, loyal, almost alive. I painted the walls a dull gray, replaced the flickering lights, and hung a new sign by the door that read, HEART SDL Core. The name wasn't just business. It was reclamation. I wasn't trying to resurrect my grandfather's company. I was honoring its soul. For the first few weeks, it was just me, the hum of the machines, and the smell of cutting oil. I worked long hours again, but this time, every sound of the spindle, every spark, every vibration meant freedom, not servitude. Then one morning, my phone rang. The number was familiar, though it took me a second to believe it. "Olivia, this is Wayne from Steel Core Dynamics." I nearly dropped my wrench. Steel Core, the same client my father had begged me to save. "We heard you've opened your own shop," Wayne said. "We've had quality issues with the new supplier. We'd like you to take over production again." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The memory of that first call, my father's voice trembling in panic, flashed through me. Only this time, it was my phone ringing. My shop they needed. "I'd be happy to," I said, my voice calm and even. "Send me the specs." That contract became my lifeline. Then the orders kept coming. One client, then another. Within a few months, the machines were running full shifts again. When I hired my first employee, it wasn't even a decision. It was instinct. Caroline, my old quality control lead, walked into the shop one morning, hair tied back, safety goggles hanging from her neck. "I heard you're hiring," she said, smiling. "And I'm tired of fixing other people's mistakes." I laughed. Welcome home. With Caroline back, everything clicked into place. Her eye for detail matched mine. Her presence filled the gaps I hadn't realized were empty. Together, we rebuilt from nothing, tightening tolerances, winning contracts, earning trust the only way I knew how, by showing up and doing the work right. By the 6th month, we were profitable. By the 8th, we had more orders than we could handle. The sound of metal cutting through metal, once a symbol of exhaustion, had become music. 1 year later, I got another call, this time from a man named Andrew Harland, the new owner of the old Hart Metal Works property. "We're liquidating the remaining equipment," he said. "I heard you used to work here. Thought you might want first pick before we scrap it all." A strange ache stirred in my chest. "I'll come by," I told him. The building looked different when I pulled up, emptier, hollowed out. The big sign had been taken down, the offices stripped bare. Dust floated in thick beams of light spilling through the high windows. Rows of machines stood quiet, like old soldiers waiting to be put to rest. Andrew led me through the floor, pointing out what was left. "Most of this is outdated," he said. "We'll just auction it off. But there's one old CNC mill in the back corner, your grandfather's. I think we were just going to scrap it. The thing barely runs." When I saw it, I froze. There it was. The first machine my grandfather had ever bought. The one I'd learned on when I was 12, standing on a crate just to reach the controls. Its frame was scratched, the paint flaking, the buttons dulled by decades of touch. Andrew shrugged. "It's worthless in production terms. But if you want it, you can take it. Consider it returning home." I ran my fingers over the cold metal, feeling the faint grooves where my grandfather's hands had once been. "I'll take it," I said quietly. It took 2 weeks of long nights to restore that machine. I replaced the bearings, recalibrated the drive motors, and polished every inch until it gleamed again. I didn't do it for output, it was too slow for modern work. But because it deserved to live. Because he deserved to live through it. When I finally powered it up, the screen flickered, the motor hummed, and I swore I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "Listen to the rhythm, Olivia. The machine always tells you what it needs." I placed the old mill in the brightest corner of my new shop, where the morning light hit it first. That became my favorite spot, the soul of the place. One afternoon, David, the retired machinist who had testified for me, stopped by. He stood silently for a long moment, eyes tracing the familiar shape of the machine. Then he reached out, placed his weathered hand on its frame, and smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said softly. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I don't need them to admit it anymore," I said. "I have my own shop now, and it still carries his name." He smiled, eyes misting. "That's how legacy really works, kid. You don't inherit it, you rebuild it." That night, after everyone left, I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the old CNC mill in the corner. The hum of its motor filled the silence like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of it settle through me. Fairness doesn't always come from those who share your blood. Sometimes it's forged by your own hands when you finally claim what you deserve. Build your own table, and when you do, open it for those who were once left outside. Call to action *, have you ever been overlooked or dismissed in your own family or your own work just because they didn't believe you could do it? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know your stories.